What's going on, beautiful people? What's going on? What's up, black man? I hope you are doing well. Hopefully, you're protecting your mental, finding time for an emotional release valve, and continue to strive to become a beneficial black man. On the Beneficial Black Man channel, we're trying to help men become beneficial to get out of gray mediocrity and be their best selves for glory and for good. I'm your host, Jamal Calpin. So, for these study hall shows that I'm doing, it's really just you joining in on my own research or the work that I'm doing, to continue to grow and accomplish things in my journey as a beneficial black man, whether that's, into previous ones, I was working on a book, editing. Yesterday, I had some extra credit where I was editing an audiobook that I was working on for a client. But today, I'm actually going to do very light because there can be a lot of deep research done. But I'm going to do very, very light research on toxic masculinity, and more specifically, where did the term originate from? And so the reason that I wanted to do this is because I recently listened to a podcast episode from the Art of Manliness podcast. And if you've never listened to or checked out the Art of Manliness podcast, I would highly recommend black men to go check that out. It's a great podcast. It covers a lot of different topics, and it has a website too. I started reading blogs and listening to podcasts from the Art of Manliness probably 2010, 2011. And I've been listening to their stuff ever since. And so they cover a lot of different stuff. They talk about style. They talk about psychology. They talk about things that men should learn how to do or whatever. And it comes from a very general sense of masculinity and what is considered manliness. And yeah, it's a platform run by a white man. But there's a lot of good stuff there. And I mean, I think we can continue to learn and benefit from knowledge and wisdom that's shared out there in the public. And so the podcast episode that I was listening to recently is podcast 886, What the World of Psychology Gets Wrong About Men. And I'm going to read the description real quick. And you can definitely go and check this out. It's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever. But yeah, definitely check it out for yourself. But all right, here. So several years ago, the American Psychological Association issued a set of guidelines for psychologists working with boys and men. Guideline number 1 says psychologists strive to recognize that masculinities are constructed based on social, cultural, and contextual norms. Guideline number 3 says psychologists understand the impact of power, privilege, and sexism on the development of boys and men and on their relationships with others. My guess for the podcast, Brett McKay is the guy who runs the website. He and his wife run the website. My guest says that these guidelines miss the mark and are just one indicator of the way in which the world of psychology misunderstands and consequently underserves men. Dr. John Barry is a psychologist, the co-founder of the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society and the co-author of the Perspectives. I hate these ads, man. Sorry. And the co-author of the Perspectives in Male Psychology textbook. Today on the show, John unpacks the issues with thinking that masculinity is purely a social construct and that men's problems grow out of their power and privilege, and how these issues prevent men from getting the help they need. In the second half of our conversation, we discuss the surprising origin of the idea of toxic masculinity, what really defines masculinity, and what effect eternalizing a negative or positive view of masculinity has on men. We end our conversation with what works for men's mental health and well-being if you don't want to go to therapy, and what you should look for in a therapist. I thought the conversation was really good. There were some things that I kind of wrestled with, I guess. But something that he mentioned, the guest, Dr. Barry mentioned, was the origin of the phrase or the term toxic masculinity. And I had never heard it mentioned. So I did, a quick search to get to the root of it to the best of my ability. Again, this is a light dig into this topic because there are people who have been discussing this researching this and talking about this for a very, very long time, So I'm not trying to say that I know more than doctors or anything like that. Far from it. I just think this is interesting. And I think it's something that we should, as men, research, we should look into and be curious about, especially if it's something that, masculinity in general is a topic of discussion in our community, but amongst us as brothers, as men. What is masculinity? What is manhood? What does it mean to be a man? And we hear a lot of buzzwords and we hear a lot of terms and a lot of discussion points tossed back and forth on podcasts and YouTube channels and things like that. But how much research are we actually doing for ourselves? Are we really digging into this stuff? So there are a couple of articles that I found when I did some of my searching, and I think one or two of them mention the origin of that term toxic masculinity. And the surprising part to me is to find out that it was actually a term coined by men. But I think it's changed a little bit over the years based off of, what I've heard and what was mentioned on that podcast. So I'm just going to go through these articles, doing some research, in the study hall and see what we can find out about toxic masculinity. So the first article that I'm going to look at, I'm going backwards. So in the sense of how recent these articles are. Going backwards, the first article is from 2022, and another one's from 2022, and then another one from 2019. And then we're going to stop with Wikipedia, which gets kind of to the source of what or where that term came from. All right, so the first article, I'll pull it up for you guys to see, this is from The Conversation, a website. Title of the article is Toxic Masculinity. What does it mean? Where did it come from? And is the term useful or harmful? This is published September 21st, 2022. It's hard to avoid encountering the term toxic masculinity these days. It has been linked to Australian soldiers' war crimes in Afghanistan, the Morrison government's low credibility with women in the lead up to this year's election, and further afield, the rise of Donald Trump and the Capitol riots. It is regularly applied to pop culture characters as diverse as the hypersensitive dinosaur nerd Ross Geller from Friends, the alcoholic adulterer Don Draper in Mad Men, and the violent repressed Nate in Euphoria, who regularly tells his girlfriend, if anyone ever tried to hurt you, I'd kill them. There you go. The term toxic masculinity was obscure in the 1990s and early 2000s, but since around 2015, it has become pervasive in discussions of men and gender. So what does it mean? Masculinity refers to the roles, behaviors, and attributes seen as appropriate for boys and men in a given society. In short, masculinity refers to society's expectations of males. In many societies, boys and men are expected to be strong, active, aggressive, tough, daring, heterosexual, emotionally inexpressive, and dominant. I think that's interesting. Emotionally inexpressive and dominant. This is enforced by socialization, media, peers, and a host of other influences, and it plays out in the behavior of many boys and men. The term toxic masculinity points to a particular version of masculinity that is unhealthy for the men and boys who conform to it, and harmful for those around them. The phrase emphasizes the worst aspects of stereotypically masculine attributes. Toxic masculinity is represented by qualities such as violence, dominance, emotional illiteracy, sexual entitlement, and hostility to femininity. This version of masculinity is seen as toxic for two reasons. First, it is bad for women. It shapes sexist and patriarchal behaviors, including abusive or violent treatment of women. Toxic masculinity thus contributes to gender inequalities that disadvantage women and privileged men. Second, toxic masculinity is bad for men and boys themselves. Narrow, stereotypical norms constrain men's physical and emotional health in their relations with women, other men, and children. So far in the article, I don't have any disagreements. I think that's true. Like, especially what was mentioned a little bit earlier about it being enforced by media, peers, and a host of other influences. I think it's really tricky and kind of a bad place when you leave aspects of your identity open to being defined by others and constructed by others. And I'm pretty sure this article is coming. Uh, I'm pretty sure this article is, yeah, it's written by a white professor, right? So majority of these terms are coming from the major culture or dominant culture, which is usually influenced by white men. And for us as black men, I think again, this is why it's important that we look into these terms, look into these identifiers, look into these things that are supposed to, we feel like we're supposed to model ourselves after and really question and wonder, is this beneficial for us? Is this beneficial for us as black men? And is it beneficial for our community, the black community? Because again, there's a lot of stuff in the major culture, and I would say the major matrix that we live in, the system that constantly influences us, that isn't necessarily beneficial for us. So yeah, that's why we need to. Oh, here we go. We're going to keep going. Origins of the term. Here we go. The term first emerged within the mythopoetic New Age men's movement of the 1980s. The movement focused on men's healing, using male-only workshops, wilderness retreats, and rites of passage to rescue what it saw as essentially masculine qualities and archetypes: the king, the warrior, the wild man, and so on, from what it dubbed toxic masculinity. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the term spread to other self help circles and into academic work, for example, on men's mental health. Some U.S. Conservatives began applying the term to low income, underemployed, marginalized men, prescribing solutions like restoring male dominated families and family values. That's interesting. Some U.S. conservatives began some U.S. conservatives began applying the term to low income, underemployed, marginalized men. So part of me wonders, are are they? I'm going to keep reading, but for these some U.S. conservatives, are they applying the term to us? This says some U.S. conservatives began applying the term to low income, underemployed, marginalized men, prescribing solutions like restoring male dominant families and family values. So that's interesting. Like, okay, let's think about this. Let's just process. So part of this study hall is just processing, processing thoughts, processing information. But I think that's interesting. That toxic masculinity would be associated to men who don't make a lot of money, who are underemployed, who are considered marginalized. It's hard for me to not think that this is automatically being ascribed to black men. Not to say that black men aren't working or aren't making a decent amount of money. But when I think about marginalized, it makes me think about, again, in reference or in relation to the greater culture and the greater society or whatever, the more dominant. So the dominant society is white. And then you have everybody else, you know? And for a long time in our community, those are things that we've struggled with. And I guess we would be considered marginalized, you know, low income, underemployed. And so it's really interesting that US, and in the other part, some US conservatives, and I think fairly recently, we know, I mean, I feel like we've known this as a community for a long time, that conservatives usually mean like, white Republicans or whatever. They're not typically the nicest towards our people. And there are a lot of stereotypes associated about us and about our people, particularly our men. that come from conservative parties, right? So that's interesting. I find that interesting. I'm going to keep reading, but I find that interesting. I think that's a nugget to think about, that like this idea of toxic masculinity is, it's not only that maybe you're like, it mentioned all this stuff, right? Like let me go back up. You know, how it's bad for men. Oh, here, toxic masculinity is represented by qualities such as violence, dominance, emotional illiteracy, sexual entitlement, and hostility to femininity. Again, I feel like a lot of this stuff could be ascribed to the men in our community, and it then being pushed or applied to a particular group of men. Some US conservatives began applying the term to low income, underemployed, marginalized men, prescribing solutions like restoring male dominated families and family values. I just find that really, really, really interesting, that I think like the archetype of toxic masculinity in a general sense could very often be just described as a black man. So it's a problem. Maybe for these conservative, these ideologies or these thoughts was like, too many of us are turning into black men, are acting like black men. I don't know. That's just a thought. Let's keep reading. Toxic masculinity was virtually non existent in academic writing, including feminist scholarship, up until 2015. So this is, fairly recent. It's 2023, right? So not even 10 years. Up until 2015 or so, other than in a handful of texts on men's health and well being. But as it spread in popular culture, feminist scholars and commentators adopted the term, typically as a shorthand for misogynistic talk and actions. Though the term is now associated with a feminist critique of the sexist norms of manhood, that's not where it started. It is virtually absent from the scholarship on men and masculinities that developed rapidly from the mid 1970s, though its use in that area has increased in the last decade. This scholarship has, however, long made the claim that culturally influential constructions of manhood exist, and that they are tied to men's domination of women. Merits, I'm not going to watch the video. Let's keep on. Merits and risks. Understood properly, the term toxic masculinity has some merits. It recognizes that the problem is a social one, emphasizing how boys and men are socialized and how their lives are organized. It steers us away from biologically essential. Oh, sorry. It steers us away from biologically essentialist or determinist perspectives that suggest the bad behavior of men is inevitable. Boys will be boys, which is, again, a terrible saying. Toxic masculinity highlights a specific form of masculinity and a specific set of social expectations that are unhealthy or dangerous. It points, rightly, to the fact that stereotypical masculine norms shape men's health as well as their treatment of other people. The term has helped to popularize feminist critiques of rigid gender norms and inequalities. It is more accessible than scholarly terms such as hegemonic masculinity. This has the potential to allow its use in educating boys and men in similar ways to the concept of the man box, a term describing a rigid set of compulsory masculine qualities that confine men and boys and other teaching tools on masculinity. By emphasizing the harm done to both men and women, the term has the potential to prompt less defensiveness among men than more overtly political terms such as patriarchal or sexist masculinity. I think that's interesting. I feel like some at this point, masculinity can sometimes be considered like it's like a trigger word for a lot of men when discussing this. But again, I think for us as black men in our community, we need to pay attention to this again in regards to the dominant culture and what they're wrestling with and what they're struggling with. And we have to pick and choose and see and identify and do the work to know, is this actually beneficial for me? And is this beneficial, and are these standards and all this stuff actually beneficial for my community? Because a lot of men, a lot of us like to talk about, I'll say a lot because I'm a man. I'm a man as well. A lot of us on podcasts and YouTube channels and blogs or whatever like to discuss the idea of being traditional. and holding up traditional values. Well, I think it's important that we question and challenge those traditions and those traditional values. Because again, here, our people being here in this country, specifically, in the United States, and I mean, I think it would be impactful across the diaspora as well. But I think we have to question which traditions we were adopting or which traditions we were forced to adopt because of the influence and acculturation of the greater system that we were forced into. And I think sometimes we also struggle with trying to reach back to, say, like the continent and other places that seem further away or not as influenced by Western culture, to kind of piece together what's actually going to be beneficial for us. Because honestly, I feel like we have to almost start from scratch to figure out what's going to be best for us. And that doesn't mean that we have to force ourselves to be traditional or force ourselves to be quote unquote modern. But I do think we need to be progressive in figuring out what's actually best. And that comes from conversation, that comes from research, that comes from trial and error. But this is why it's important that we actually look into these things, like asking and questioning what is masculinity, what is manhood, and talking about it amongst ourselves, and then getting the input from those we are supposed to be serving. Because again, as I mentioned before, as Black men, as beneficial Black men, we're servant leaders for our community, and it's important that as leaders we check in with those who we're serving and asking, like, hey, how am I doing here? What do you think can improve on, and stuff like that, so that we can actually be better at what we're called to do or what we're expected to do. Because just trying to figure it out in isolation without actually considering those who you're impacting is ineffective leadership, and it's foolish. And I think that also puts us in like an echo chamber and forces us to like rely heavily on our ego, which is dangerous. Not a good place to be. All right, let's continue reading this article because we got a couple more to go. All right, let's see. I'll continue from this paragraph. By emphasizing the harm done to both men and women, the term has the potential to prompt less defensiveness among men than more overtly political terms such as patriarchal or sexist masculinity. Toxic risks. Toxic masculinity also carries some potential risks. It is too readily misheard as a suggestion that all men are toxic. It can make men feel blamed and attacked. The last thing we need if we want to invite men and boys to critically reflect on masculinity and gender. I can agree with that, but I think there's nuance, of course. But I think it's also important to look at reality. Like, very often, I kind of mentioned that the difference between just being a good guy and being a beneficial man, whether it's good guy, nice guy, when we are trying to critically reflect on masculinity and gender and critically reflect on our community as Black men, as Black people, I think we as men can fight so much to try to remain quote unquote good and nice and have exceptions to not realize that actually our situation is actually pretty bad, and it can be pretty bleak. And so there's always a lot of pushback, but I think as a good leader you got to sit and listen, and you got to sit and like, I think about if you work at a corporation or a company and they have for their employees, which I hope most companies do, they have like a complaint box, or like, is there issues or something while you're on the job? I think it's effective leadership actually sits down and reads all of the complaints. They listen to all of the issues that are expressed, and they don't immediately try to dismiss them. But I can understand pride and ego and how difficult it can be to actually hear that, like, no, things are actually really, really bad. And the majority of the issues stem from Black men in our community. And, like, was it Dr. Umar recently on the podcast that he was on? He's, I guess, catching flack. I guess people are talking about, like, his comments pretty much saying, like, yeah, all of the majority of the issue, if not all of the issues that are plaguing our community, stem and are related to Black men. And that's something we need to own up for and deal with. We have to take responsibility for it, whether we think it's our fault or not. As men, we serve our community. We're supposed to be protecting our community and providing and trying to help prosper our community. But we can't effectively do that if we don't sit and actually look at all of the facts. If we don't sit and accept and analyze all of the critiques and criticisms and complaints. And so, yeah, I think it, when it comes up to toxic masculinity or masculinity in general, there's always a lot of immediate pushback. But we need to get to a place where we can actually just listen so that we can critically reflect, like the author of this article is saying. Sorry, let me continue. Persuasive public messaging aimed at men may be more effective if it holds the language of masculinity altogether. Oh, if it avoids the language of masculinity altogether. Okay. Whether it uses the term toxic masculinity or not, any criticism of the ugly things some men do or of dominant norms of manhood will provoke defensive and hostile reactions among some men. This is true. And I think some men at this point have platforms and they have podcasts and they have YouTube channels and they say a lot of stuff that then creates an echo chamber, and it's not actually helping us as a community. Criticisms of sexism and unequal gender relations often provoke a backlash in the form of predictable expressions of anti-feminist sentiments. The term might also draw attention to male disadvantage and neglect male privilege. Dominant gender norms may be toxic for men, but they also provide a range of unearned privileges, workplace expectations of leadership, freedom from unpaid care work, prioritizing of their sexual needs over women's, and inform some men's harmful behavior towards women. Toxic masculinity can be used in generalizing and simplistic ways. Decades of scholarship have established that constructions of masculinity are diverse, intersecting with other forms of social difference. The term may cement the assumption that the only way to involve men in progress towards gender equality is by fostering a healthy or positive masculinity. Yes, we need to redefine norms of manhood, but we also need to encourage men to invest less in gender identities and boundaries, stop policing manhood, and embrace ethical identities less defined by gender. Whatever language we use, we need ways to name the influential social norms associated with manhood, critique the harmful attitudes and behaviors some men adopt, and foster healthier lives for men and boys. I agree with this. And this is something that more specifically we need to do in our community as Black men. We got to figure out what's actually going to be best for us, what's going to be best for the boys that are in our community, and what's going to be best for the community as a whole, so that we can set these standards and strive towards them. Again, for the health of our community. Because again, yes, there's issues with men. There are issues that men wrestle with all over the world, But I think it's important that we are Black first, that we focus on how can we fix our problems first before we go out and try to adopt or fix everybody's issues. No, we need to deal with our issues first so that we're healthy, secure, stable. That way, if we want to go help other people, we can, because I think we can spend too much energy going out and dealing with things outwards or trying to adopt in like the acceptance of the outward community and outward society, that we constantly neglect what is happening internally. It's like the example of a preacher or a pastor putting all of his energy into growing and serving his church, that he neglects his home. And I think as Black men, we've done that a lot in our community over time. We haven't done the effective work of making sure that our community is okay, that our households are okay, that our neighborhoods are okay. We go and serve lots of other people and cater to lots of other people and strive for the acceptance of lots of other people, usually white people, and don't do the work that's necessary to make sure that our people are okay. All right, so that was the first article. Let's move on to the second one. All right. The next article, again, we're talking about toxic masculinity and trying to like get an understanding of where the term comes from. And from the previous article that I just read, it actually, I guess the earliest record of it came from this men's group in like the 1980s. And I think in a couple more articles, we might get a little bit more details on that. All right, let's see the next article. This is from psi.org, phys.org. The title of the article is Toxic Masculinity. What does it mean? Where did it come from? And is the term useful or harmful? This is written by Michael Flood. All right. It's hard to avoid encountering the term toxic masculinity these days. It has been, is this the same? Wait a minute. Oh, snap. Did this person just steal this other person's article? Wait, hold on. Wow. I think it did. Oh, no. Or maybe, because this is a different guy. Oh, no. Oh, no. It's the same guy. All right. Well, scrap this one. This is the same article. This is the same article. Oh, okay. It's republished. Okay. All right. Next. So the next article that I'm actually going to read is from The Atlantic. And it's the problem with the fight against, it's entitled The Problem with the Fight Against Toxic Masculinity. This is definitely written by somebody else. This is a different article. It's not a republished. So it's good. Saves us time too. So I don't have to read that other article because it's the same article as the other one. Anyways, here we go. The problem with the fight against toxic masculinity. The popular term points toward very real problems of male violence and sexism, but it risks misrepresenting what actually causes them, by Michael Salter. All right. And this was written or published February 27th, 2019. Okay. Yes, this is your last free article, whatever. Over the past several years, toxic masculinity has become a catch-all explanation for male violence and sexism. The appeal of the term, which distinguishes toxic traits such as aggression and self-entitlement from healthy masculinity, has grown to the point where Gillette invoked it last month in a viral advertisement against bullying and sexual harassment. Around the same time, the American Psychological Association introduced new guidelines for therapists working with boys and men, which was talked about in that podcast that I mentioned on the Art of Manliness podcast, warning that extreme forms of certain traditional masculine traits are linked to aggression, misogyny, and negative health outcomes. A predictable conflict has accompanied the term's rise. Many conservatives allege that charges of toxic masculinity are an attack on manhood itself, at a time when men already face challenges such as higher rates of drug overdose and suicide, or self-deletion, sorry. Many progressives, meanwhile, contend that the detoxification of masculinity is an essential pathway to gender equality. Amid this heated discourse, newspaper and magazine articles have blamed toxic masculinity for rape, deletion, mass deletion, gang violence, online trolling, climate change, Brexit, and the election of Donald Trump. I was going to say something. Oh, I understand that some men like to push back. So let me read this sentence again. Many progressives, meanwhile, contend that the detoxification of masculinity is an essential pathway to gender equality. I know it's I'll say a lot of men have issue with like the term toxic masculinity and then having the discussions about masculinity because they ultimately think it's like uh, influenced or driven by the feminist movement. I think even before you get that far in regards to like equality, like gender equality, it's important to know that a lot of these standards, these things that are considered toxic masculinity, actually harm us even before we start to relate to the opposite sex. And that's important to know. Like it's not always about uh, women taking advantage of men or society trying to get rid of men. Like, no, work needs to be done so that we can actually be healthier, um, and better equipped to serve other people and better equipped to just live a better life. You know, uh, toxic masculinity, patriarchy, capitalism, all these things, they harm us. And more specifically, they harm the Black community. And that's something we need to be aware of and something we need to address and try to navigate as beneficial Black men and as servant leaders in our community. All right, let's keep going. Masculinity can indeed be destructive, but both conservative and liberal stances on this issue commonly misunderstand how the term toxic masculinity functions. When people use it, they tend to diagnose the problem of masculine aggression and entitlement as a cultural or spiritual illness, something that has infected today's men and leads them to reproachable acts. But toxic masculinity itself is not a cause. Over the past 30 years, as the concept has morphed and changed, it has served more as a barometer for the gender politics of its day and as an arrow toward the subtler, shifting causes of violence and sexism. There we go. Despite the term's recent popularity among feminists, toxic masculinity did not originate with the women's movement. It was coined in the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s and 1990s, motivated in part as a reaction to second wave feminism. Okay. Through male-only workshops, wilderness retreats, and drumming circles, this movement promoted a masculine spirituality to rescue what it referred to as the deep masculine, a protective warrior masculinity from toxic masculinity. Men's aggression and frustration was, according to the movement, the result of a society that feminized boys by denying them the necessary rites and rituals to realize their true selves as men. Interesting. Men's aggression, and so in hearing this, like I mentioned before, one of the reasons that I wanted to look into this and kind of do some research behind the origins of the term toxic masculinity is because in the podcast, the doctor, can't remember his name right now, but the doctor, he mentioned the origin, and he in the past two articles, it's been referenced the term being coined in the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s and 90s. And the way that he described it was toxic masculinity was pretty much men not being men. So the idea of it wasn't solely isolated to misogyny. It wasn't solely isolated to hyper aggressive behavior or whatever, but it was like men being lazy and not working and not serving their community and not being beneficial to their community around them and to a greater good. That was toxic. That was toxic masculinity. But yeah, I think it's interesting. It says men's aggression and frustration was, according to the movement, the result of a society that feminized boys by denying them the necessary rites and rituals to realize their true selves as men. I guess when I read that, I think I can kind of see that, especially if you have, thinking about our community, especially if you have a community with a lot of men absent and not serving and not being beneficial. That kind of puts single mothers in a position where they're doing their best, and in a lot of in a lot of incidences, young boys are coddled and not raised to be beneficial men. And I don't think that's at no fault of the mother, because the father should have been there to be raising his son. The men in the community should have been there to be helping mentor that young boy, the young man, to become beneficial for his community. And I can see how that could potentially lead to men. I don't know if I would say it as feminized, but going back to what I initially heard from the podcast, I can see how that can lead to men being undisciplined, not maturing effectively, and not getting to a place where they're actually serving their community. But let's keep reading. The claim of a singular, real masculinity has been roundly rejected since the late 1980s by a new sociology of masculinity, led by the sociologist Raywin Connell. This school of thought presents, I apologize to this person, Raywin. That's actually a pretty name, Raywin Connell. This school of thought presents gender as the product of relations and behaviors, rather than as a fixed set of identities and attributes. Connell's work describes multiple masculinities shaped by class, race, culture, sexuality, and other factors, often in competition with one another as to which can claim to be more authentic. Interesting. In this view, which is now the prevailing social scientific understanding of masculinity, the standards by which a real man is defined can vary dramatically across time and place. I think that's good to know, and that this sociologist identified that masculinity is shaped by class, race, culture, and sexuality, and other factors. Because, again, even though the dominant culture and the dominant matrix has so much influence on us, we, again, as Black men in our community, need to identify what is actually best for us and best for our people, and not just automatically taking taking what's presented to us and given to us in things like mass media. Continuing, Connell and others theorize that common masculine ideals such as social respect, physical strength, and sexual potency become problematic when they set unattainable standards. When I think about sexual potency and standards, I think about the stuff that like Fresh and Fit say about like you need to have, it's like 50 experiences or bodies or whatever. Like I don't understand why guys don't realize that they're these kind of talking points and these ideas are teaching you to be a hoe. Like they're teaching you to be a 304. They're teaching you to be a whoremonger. They're teaching you to be promiscuous and saying, oh yeah, that's what a man's supposed to do. Like why? They're and then saying that, oh, that's just men's nature. That they just have to go around and hump everything that they see. Like what? Why are you saying this? Why don't you guys have self-control or standards? But I can see that if you have this, like this person is saying, I don't know if it's a man or a woman. They're saying that, you, culturally speaking, within the society, unattainable standards are set. And I wouldn't even not only say unattainable standards, but ridiculous, unhealthy standards that are mediocre. I think that's trying to strive to have quote unquote 50 bodies or 50 sexual experiences. That's great mediocrity. That's lazy. That's weak-willed. And it's not beneficial. It's destructive. It's destructive to your own body first. Like you shouldn't be sleeping around that much. This is stupid. Anyway, sorry. Falling short can make boys and men insecure and anxious, which might prompt them to use force in order to feel and be seen as dominant and in control. This is true because, I mean, we see this in regards to like incel community, red pill community, that, this frustration towards modern women because just because you have money or physical prowess, that you are owed or you deserve to meet this standard of sexual experience. And it leads to rape, it leads to misogyny, it leads to objectification of women, it leads to a lot of terrible stuff that impacts our community, but the society as a whole. Where we pick up, all right. Male violence in this scenario doesn't emanate from something bad or toxic that has crept into the nature of masculinity itself. Rather, it comes from these men's social and political settings, the particularities of which set them up for inner conflicts over social expectations and male entitlement. I like this because I think it ties into why it's so important that we learn to think right for ourselves. We have to think better, because if you think bad, you believe bad things and you do bad things. And you believe, even before you actually say, you never go out and actually harm or do anything to somebody. But if you have negative beliefs about yourself, that can lead to depression, that can lead to poor mental and emotional well-being. And so, yeah, reading this again, rather it comes from these men's social and political settings, the particularities of which set them up for inner conflicts over social expectations and male entitlement. That's not good. The popular discussion of masculinity has often presumed there are fixed character types among men, Connell told me. I'm skeptical of the idea of character types. I think it's more important to understand the situations in which groups of men act, the patterns in their actions, and the consequences of what they do. As this research was popularized, however, it was increasingly mischaracterized. By the mid-2000s, despite Connell's objections, it's a lady, her complex theories were being portrayed in ways that echoed mythopoetic archetypes of healthy and destructive masculinity. Hold on, let me read this again. By the mid-2000s, despite Connell's objections, her complex theories were being portrayed in ways that echoed mythopoetic archetypes of healthy and destructive masculinity. In a 2005 study of men in prison, the psychiatrist Terry Coopers defined toxic masculinity as the constellation of socially regressive male traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence. Referencing Connell's work, Coopers argued that prison brings out the toxic aspects of masculinity in prisoners, but that this toxicity is already present in the wider cultural context. Coopers told me that he believes critics of his study incorrectly assumed that he claimed masculinity itself is toxic, though he acknowledged that the article could have explained his position in greater detail. I can understand that frustration in regards to what you're trying to communicate, because it sucks to be misunderstood, and you may have all good intentions in the world, but if you say stuff and that people misunderstand it and take it and run with it, it's like nothing you can do about it. Anyways, that's a personal thing. Since then, the return to toxic masculinity has leaked from academic literature to wide cultural circulation. Today, the concept offers an appealingly simple diagnosis for gender violence and masculine failure. Those are the toxic parts of masculinity, distinct from the good parts. Okay. New proponents of the concept, sometimes unaware of its origins, tend to agree that men and boys are affected by a social sickness and that the cure is cultural renewal. That is, men and boys need to change their values and attitudes. I agree. Former President Barack Obama is championing mentoring programs as the solution to a self-defeating model for being a man, in which respect is gained through violence. A range of classes and programs encourage boys and men to get in touch with their feelings and to develop a healthy, progressive masculinity. In some educational settings, these programs are becoming mandatory. Mandatory could be good. Probably should be good. But I think initially one of the earlier problems is, I think fathers should be in the home to be there, and the men in the community need to have better values and attitudes themselves. But this last part of this paragraph reminds me of the work that Jason Wilson does with the Cave of Adullam. Look that up because it's cool. But he has this program where he uses martial arts to help young Black boys to mature and develop into becoming comprehensive men. So yeah, I think, again, I agree. I think mentoring programs are necessary. And recently I follow, can't remember his name right now. There's another YouTuber, uh, Urban Nerds. I think Urban Nerds is like his merch line and the thing that he pushes. But he had a YouTube video up about the importance of mentoring programs and how they're necessary within our community. And I think it's true. Certainly, these programs can have a positive impact. Research consistently shows that boys and men who hold sexist attitudes are more likely to perpetrate gendered violence. Connell herself notes that when the term toxic masculinity refers to the assertion of masculine privilege or men's power, it is making a worthwhile point. There are well known gender patterns in violent and abusive behavior. Okay, I think this article is almost over. The question is, where do these sexist attitudes come from? Are men and boys just the victims of cultural brainwashing into misogyny and aggression, requiring re education into the right beliefs? Or are these problems more deep seated and created by the myriad insecurities and contradictions of men's lives under gender inequality? The problem with a crusade against toxic masculinity is that in targeting culture as the enemy, it risks overlooking the real life conditions and forces that sustain culture. Okay. There's genuine danger in this misperception. By focusing on culture, people who oppose toxic masculinity can inadvertently collude with institutions that perpetuate it. For example, the alcohol industry has funded research to deny the relationship between alcohol and violence, instead blaming masculinity in cultures of drinking. Okay. In this regard, the industry is repeating liberal feminist arguments about toxic masculinity. However, there is strong evidence that the density of liquor shops in a given geographic area increases the local rate of domestic violence. That's okay. Any serious framework for preventing violence against women will address alcohol availability as well as masculine norms and sexism. I think this is good. And I also think this is an example of why we have to, as Black men in our community, have standards that help us. Um, because I can see that. And it sucks because I think about a lot of the neighborhoods and living conditions that our people are in. You know, you have like 3, 4 stores that repeat over and over and over again, especially in like urban or inner city scenarios. You have a beauty supply store, a carryout, a church, and a liquor store. And so, based off of this, it, along with the cultural influence and stuff like that that's tied to toxic masculinity, yeah, if you have alcohol and drugs and all that stuff, that's going to influence and lead to DV as well, you know, and increase the impact of it. So we need to take a step away and look at what are things that we've picked up from this greater matrix, this greater culture that is not benefiting us, from this greater society that is not benefiting us, and shut it down, you know, and get it under control. And we keep reading. The concept of toxic masculinity encourages an assumption that the causes of male violence and other social problems are the same everywhere, and therefore that the solutions are the same as well. But as Connell and her cohort have spent years demonstrating, material realities matter. While themes of violence, entitlement, and sexism recur across communities, they show up differently in different places. In one Australian Aboriginal in one Australian Aboriginal violence prevention program that I evaluated with colleagues, Aboriginal educators worked in partnership with men and boys to identify the key drivers of gender violence and inequality. Solutions were rooted in cultural pride, tailored to local contexts, and underpinned by recognition of the intergenerational impacts of racism and trauma. Wow. The program understood that masculinity itself isn't toxic, and instead sought to understand and change the roots of toxic gendered behavior. Those roots are quite different than, for example, the roots evident in majority white, wealthy communities where male violence and sexism are commonplace. This is right on, pretty much what I was saying, you know, and this is the first time I'm reading this article. But yeah, like communities are different, people are different, and we need to turn internally and deal with our stuff and acknowledge our stuff, and then, you know, try to keep the things that are good work on the things that are beneficial for us, and get rid of all the other crap. Responses to gender inequality in professional workplaces, such as programs to stamp out sexism in employment culture and practices, have particular purchase in middle class communities. I do know how to read. They're not universal solutions, and they don't have to be. Recognizing differences in the lives of men and boys is crucial to the effectiveness of efforts to resolve gender violence and inequality. I think that was a pretty good article. Okay. All right. So the last thing I'm going to look at, and then I'm going to wrap this up because this has actually been quite lengthy live. The last thing I'm going to look at is, okay, this is short, but the font is small. But we're going to look at toxic masculinity on the Wikipedia page because I think it gives a little bit more information to the origin of the term toxic masculinity. But yeah, I mean, thus far, I don't know. I mean, I hope you all are seeing some good stuff here as I continue to do my own research. But this is, again, it's just, to me, this is just reaffirming and why it's more important that we have to do this internal work. We have to work on our thinking. We have to get to a better mental health state. And again, it's not limited to depression and anxiety, but really our computation of how we conclude things. Like, what is the foundation of our thoughts that influence our behavior, our beliefs, and our actions as men? I think that's so crucial that we do that. All right, let's walk through this article and then wrap this up. Toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is a set of certain male behaviors associated with harm to society and men themselves. Stereotypical aspects of traditional masculinity, such as social dominance, misogyny, and homophobia, can be considered toxic due in part to their promotion of violence, including sexual assault and DV. Socialization of boys often normalizes violence, such as in the saying, boys will be boys, about bullying and aggression. Self-reliance and emotional repression are correlated with increased psychological problems in men, such as depression, increased stress, and substance use disorders. Toxic masculine traits are characteristic of the unspoken code of behavior among men in prisons, where they exist in part as a response to the harsh conditions of prison life. Other traditionally masculine traits, such as devotion to work, pride, and excelling at sports and providing for one's family, are not considered to be toxic. The concept was originally used by authors associated with the mythopoetic men's movement, such as Shepherd Bliss. These authors contrasted stereotypical notions of masculinity with a real or deep masculinity, which they said men had lost touch with in modern society. Critics of the term toxic masculinity argue that it incorrectly implies that gender-related issues are caused by inherent male traits. The concept of toxic masculinity, or certain formulations of it, has been criticized by some conservatives as an undue condemnation of traditional masculinity, and by some feminists as an essentialist concept that ignores the role of choice and context in causing harmful behaviors and attitudes related to masculinity. And hold on, let me read this last part again. And by some feminists as an essentialist concept that ignores the role of choice and context in causing harmful behaviors and attitudes related to masculinity. I do want to say it's important that we recognize and realize that choice is important to all of this. And again, I think if you think better, you can be better, so you can do better. And I think if you have bad thinking and you have bad beliefs, it kind of limits and influences your choices. And so, yeah, we still need to get to the root at having better mental health. All right, terminology. The term toxic masculinity originated in the, I'm struggling with this word, in the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s and 90s. It later found wide use in both academic and popular writing. Popular and media discussions in the 2010s have used the term to refer to traditional and stereotypical norms of masculinity and manhood, According to the sociologist, we just read his article, Michael Flood, these include expectation that boys and men must be active, aggressive, tough, daring, and dominant. All right, let's see what this says. Mythopoetic movement. Some authors associated with the mythopoetic men's movement have referred to the social pressures placed upon men to be violent, competitive, independent, and unfeeling as a toxic form of masculinity. I don't personally, I don't think I see anything wrong with that. But okay, let me make sure I understood that sentence. Some authors associated with the mythopoetic men's movement have referred to the social pressures placed upon men to be violent, competitive, independent, and unfeeling as a toxic form of masculinity, in contrast to a real or deep masculinity that they say men have lost touch with in modern society. I think that's interesting. It seems like if we want to be traditional, we should be less toxic. Just off of that phrase here. So, modern men, I'm just spitballing right now. So, modern men are more toxic now. And quote unquote traditional men should be more real and deep and more beneficial. So when so when a lot of these guys talk about being traditional and having this expectation for women to be more traditional, that means they should also be striving to be more traditional. So they should be more real. They should be more deep. They should be less violent. They should be less competitive, less independent, and less unfeeling. So they should be more mature. But I don't think a lot of these guys understand what traditional is, or they have a warped view of what it is. That's interesting. Okay. The academic Shepard Bliss proposed a return to agrarianism as an alternative to the potentially toxic masculinity of the warrior ethic. So I think that means farming, but let's see what this thing. Agrarianism is a political and social philosophy that has promoted subsistence, agricultural, small holdings, and egalitarianism, with agrarian political parties normally supporting the rights and sustainability of small farmers and poor peasants. Why they gotta be poor? And poor peasants against the wealthy in society and highly developed and industrial nations. Okay. I would sum that up as propose a return to being more community-based. Okay. Again, this is light studying, but I think I will come back to this at a separate time. Sociologist Michael Kimmel writes that Bliss's notion of toxic masculinity can be seen as part of the mythopoetic movement's response to male feelings of powerlessness at a time when the feminist movement was challenging traditional male authority. Thus, Shepard Bliss, for example, rails against what he calls toxic masculinity, which he believes is responsible for most of the evil in the world, and proclaims the unheralded goodness of the men who fight the fires and till the soil and nurture their families. Interesting. Thus, I'm gonna read that again. Thus, Shepard Bliss, for example, rails against what he calls toxic masculinity, which he believes is responsible for most of the evil in the world, and proclaims the unheralded goodness of the men who fight the fires and till the soil and nurture their families. That actually sounds beneficial. Anyways, academic usage. I think, all right, I'm just going to read through this because this is kind of a lot. And I think it might touch back on some of those articles that we already read. But all right, academic usage. In the social sciences, toxic masculinity refers to traditional culture masculine norms that can be harmful to men, women, and society overall. This concept of toxic masculinity does not condemn men or male attributes, but rather emphasizes the harmful effects of conformity to certain traditional masculine ideal behaviors such as dominance, self-reliance, and competition. Toxic masculinity is thus defined by adherence to traditional male gender roles that consequently stigmatize and limit the emotions boys and men may comfortably express while elevating other emotions such as anger. Interesting. Wait, gotta read that again. Toxic masculinity is thus defined by adherence to traditional male gender roles that consequently stigmatize and limit the emotions boys and men may comfortably express while elevating other emotions such as anger. It is marked by economic, political, and social expectations that men seek and achieve dominance. So, I feel like I was kind of just talking about this. Traditional male gender roles is thus defined by adherence to traditional male gender. So being a traditional man is actually toxic. Maybe I'm misunderstanding that. Okay. In a gender studies context, Raewyn Connell refers to toxic practices that may arise out of what she terms hegemonic masculinity rather than essential traits. Connell argues that such practices, such as physical violence, may serve to reinforce men's dominance over women in Western societies. She stresses that such practices are a salient feature of hegemonic masculinity, although not always the defining features. Terry Cooper is of the Terry Cooper's The Right Institute describes toxic masculinity as the constellation of socially regressive male traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence. That was referenced. That was mentioned in another article that we just read, involving the need to aggressively compete and dominate others. Sounds very alpha-like, alpha male-ish. According to Cooper's, toxic masculinity includes aspects of hegemonic masculinity that are socially destructive, such as misogyny, homophobia, greed, and violent domination. These are contrast. I feel like the thought keeps coming up in mind in regards to hegemonic or hegemony. It's like I'm on dictionary.com just to be safe. Let's look up hegemony. Only reason I'm looking this up and this thought keeps coming to mind is because I studied this in college, or this because of what I studied in college. This came up a lot. Hegemony. So hegemony is leadership or predominant influence exercised by one nation over others, as in a confederation. Leadership, predominance. So yeah, when you have a hegemonic masculinity, it's kind of like what the Matrix teaches and forces upon everybody else. So hegemonic thought, hegemonic doctrine, hegemonic whatever is like the overarching, overruling thing that is taught and forced upon everybody else. Sorry, that I had to get that thought out because it just kept coming up. But I'll start the sentence over again. According to Cooper's, one second. According to Cooper's, toxic masculinity includes aspects of hegemonic masculinity that are socially destructive, such as misogyny, homophobia, greed, and violent domination. These are contrasted with more positive traits, such as pride in one's ability to win at sports, to maintain solidarity with a friend, to succeed at work, or to provide for one's family. Feminist author John Stoltenberg has argued that all traditional notions of masculinity are toxic and reinforce the oppression of women. I think this is hilarious. I'm sorry. I probably shouldn't laugh, but I think this is hilarious. Again, all of these guys, all of these red pill alpha guys who are striving and contesting constantly for traditional values or traditional men and traditional women. It's not good. And I don't even know if they know that. I mean, clearly other people know because they push back and like don't want to ascribe to it. But things that were quote unquote traditional weren't necessarily beneficial for everybody. So we really need to stop saying that. We really need to stop encouraging and trying to get to quote unquote a traditional place with traditional families, traditional men and women, whatever. I think we need to be just healthy because some traditions aren't good. some things that you do. For example, eating certain foods during traditional holidays is actually bad for your health. But because we, particularly I would say in our community, because we value and uphold traditions so much, we want to keep eating the same unhealthy foods year after year just to keep up traditions. When we should really critique and question, is this good? Because not every tradition is good. And so, yeah, we need to be more progressive. And I won't even just say modern, but we need to focus on being beneficial, being healthy, like what is actually best for us and our community. All right, I think there are two more. Oh God, there are three more sections. Sorry, I'm wrapping up because it's like one of the longest lives I've done. All right, excuse me. Gender norms. According to Cooper's, toxic masculine norms are a feature of life for men in American prisons, where they are reflected in the behavior of both staff and inmates. The qualities of extreme self reliance, domination of other men through violence, and avoiding the appearance of either femininity or weakness comprise an unspoken code among prisoners. Suppressing vulnerable emotions is often adopted to successfully cope with the harsh conditions of prison life, defined by punishment, social isolation, and aggression. These factors like these factors likely play a role in suicide, self-deletion among male prisoners. That could be a whole other thing, like dealing with prisons and prison industrialization complex, and again how that, even just more specifically, how that affects our community. All right, let me continue. Toxic masculinity can also take the form of bullying of boys by their peers and DV directed toward boys at home. The often violent socialization of boys produces psychological trauma through the promotion of aggression and lack of interpersonal connection. Such trauma is often disregarded, such as in the saying, "Boys will be boys" about bullying. The promotion of idealized masculine roles emphasizing toughness, dominance, self reliance, and the restriction of emotion can begin as early as infancy. Such norms are transmitted by parents, other male relatives, and members of the community. Media representations of masculinity on websites often, such as YouTube, often promote similar stereotypical gender roles. According to Ronald F. Levant and others, traditionally prescribed masculine behaviors can produce harmful effects, including violence, including SA and DV, promiscuity, risky and or socially irresponsible behaviors, including substance use disorders, and dysfunction in relationships. Wow. Health effects. The American Psychological Association has warned that traditional, like, some of this stuff, and I know I need to wrap this up, but some of this stuff is clear. People are doing research on this stuff. There are men who are doing research on this. Again, we don't even have to get into feminism and all that or whatever, but there are men who are doing research on this because they understand that it's not good for men. But there are so many loud voices and platforms who are trying to keep us in a traditional place. All right, health effects. The American Psychological Association has warned that traditional masculinity ideology is associated with negative effects on mental and physical health. Men who adhere to traditionally masculine cultural norms, such as risk-taking, violence, dominance, the primacy of work, need for emotional control, desire to win, and pursuit of social status, tend to be more likely to experience psychological problems such as depression, stress, body image problems, substance use, and poor social functioning. The effect tends to be stronger in men who also emphasize toxic masculine norms such as self-reliance, seeking power over women, and sexual promiscuity or playboy behavior. The APA guidelines were criticized by the British Psychological Society in a 2022 practice briefing on psychological intervention for men, which argued that the concept of toxic masculinity may damage the therapeutic alliance, discourage men seeking therapy, and contribute to the misdiagnosis of trauma. Okay. The social value of self reliance has diminished over time as modern American society has moved more toward interdependence. Both self reliance and the stifling of emotional expression can work against mental health, as they make it less likely for men to seek psychological help or to possess the ability to deal with difficult emotions. This is why we need counseling. This is why we need to continue to grow in our mental and health management. This is why we need emotional release valves, all that stuff. Preliminary research suggests that cultural pressure for men to be stoic and self reliant may also shorten men's lifespans, dang, by causing them to be less likely to discuss health problems with their physicians. Toxic masculinity is also implicated in socially created public health problems, such as elevated rates of alcoholism and certain types of cancer among men, or the role of trophy hunting sexual behavior, and rates of transmission of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. Yeah, you gotta get those 50 bodies. Psychiatrist, psychiatrist, oh my God. Psychiatrist Frank Pittman wrote about how men are harmed by traditional masculine norms, suggesting this includes shorter lifespans, greater incidences of violent death, and ailments such as lung cancer and come on, guys, and cirrhosis of the liver. So I'm not gonna sit here and struggle with this, but yes, I'm struggling that to say that word. I'll have to deal with that later. Cirrhosis of the liver. All right, and end of that. Okay, criticism. Some conservatives, as well as many in the alt right, see toxic masculinity as an incoherent concept or believe that there is no such thing as toxic masculinity. In January 2019, conservative political commentators criticized the new American Psychological Association guidelines for warning about harms associated with traditional masculinity ideology, arguing that it constitutes an attack on masculinity. APA Chief of Professional Practice, Jared Skillings, responded to conservative criticism, stating that the report's discussion of traditional masculinity is about negative traits such as violence or over competitiveness or being unwilling to admit weakness, and noting that the report also discusses positive traits traditionally associated with masculinity, such as courage, leadership, and protectiveness. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I think this is a great article uh, or a great entry on Wikipedia about toxic masculinity. And I think if you're just open to like the reality that there could be a better way to be healthier, to be more beneficial, and to just grow as a man, I think that would be important. I think that's a great article. And I think even just going back and sort of searching the history of what toxic masculinity or that term, where it comes from, and realizing that initially it was toxic masculinity was really demonizing all of the negative crap that people are fighting for today. Like men were trying to separate that this over here is not beneficial. These concepts, these ideas, these traditions are not beneficial to us as men and not to those we're called to relate to and to care about and to serve. I don't I don't know why people want to fight back against that. But I guess if you don't do the research, if you don't go back and see like, oh no, toxic masculinity, it is kind of trash. We don't want that. And that it's not inherently saying that all masculinity is bad or that all of manhood and being masculine is bad. No, it's saying like we have a standard, and with this standard, all of this other trash, all of the stuff that may be associated with traditional masculinity, we should avoid. It needs to be identified as toxic. We need to separate ourselves from it so that we can be better. I like that one line that guy was saying, like focusing on like nurturing your families. So many men, I feel like don't. understand that that's part of being a man, is to nurture and prosper those who are around you. And it really starts with yourself. Like, are you actually taking care of yourself and benefiting yourself? But all right, this has been, I think, been a full study hall of information. And there are a lot of things here still for me to ponder. And so I'm going to have to set these articles aside. But I thought this was pretty good. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this, please like, share, let me know your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel. And I will catch you guys next time. Black man, I believe in you. Continue to strive to become a beneficial Black man. Make time for an emotional release valve. Protect your mental, and make something for yourself, make something of yourself, and make something for glory and for good. I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.